You know, back in the 1950s and 60s, America was really at a crossroads. There was this deeply entrenched system of oppression, Jim Crow, and it was about to face a challenge like never before. So what we're going to do is dive into the story of how ordinary people, with just incredible courage and some brilliant strategies, managed to tear down that system and change the course of the nation forever.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to step into the world of Jim Crow, just to understand what segregation really felt like. Then, we'll look at the first legal wins that started to chip away at its foundation. After that, we'll see how the movement just exploded onto the streets, how the whole nation was basically forced to pay attention, and finally, we'll talk about the laws that were passed, the tragic losses, and the unbelievable legacy this movement left behind.
So, to really get what this fight was all about, you've got to understand what they were up against. Before the movement really hit the national stage, life for Black Americans in the South was defined by this brutal system of racial oppression called Jim Crow.
And that's the key thing to remember here. Jim Crow wasn't just, some social habit or a custom. No, it was the actual law. These were real state and local statutes put on the books specifically to keep Black and white people separate in pretty much every single part of public life.
And this system, it touched literally every part of daily life. We're talking separate schools, separate water fountains, the back of the bus, you name it. But it went so much deeper. It meant being shut out of good jobs and a decent education. It meant you could be blocked from voting because of ridiculous literacy tests you could never pass or poll taxes you couldn't afford. And hanging over all of this was this constant looming threat of violence for anyone who even thought about stepping out of line.
But, even in this incredibly oppressive environment, a new strategy started to form. Activists began to realize that the system's own rules, the laws, the courts, well, maybe they could be used against it to tear it down from the inside out.
Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is basically a 60-year legal battle all in one snapshot. For decades, this idea of separate but equal from the Plessy v. Ferguson case was the legal justification for all of segregation. But then, in 1954, everything changed. A team of NAACP lawyers, led by the legendary Thurgood Marshall, won a monumental case. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court finally said, no, in public schools, separate is inherently unequal.
And this is so crucial, right? The court's decision wasn't just about buildings or books, it was about people. It was about psychology. It was the court officially saying, hey, segregation does real psychological harm, especially to kids. And that gave the movement this incredible moral and legal high ground to build on.
Now, legal victories in a courtroom are one thing, but to really ignite a mass movement, well, that often takes a single powerful act of defiance. And in Montgomery, Alabama, that act came from Rosa Parks. Her quiet, firm refusal to give up her seat on a bus was the spark that lit an absolute fire.
I mean, just stop and think about that number. 381 days. That's more than a year. An entire community organized themselves. They set up carpools, they walked for miles to get to work every single day, and they held the line. They refused to ride those segregated buses. This wasn't just a protest. It was a full-blown economic and social rebellion.
And the amazing thing? It worked. The Supreme Court eventually struck down bus segregation in Montgomery, so the victory was huge, and it was twofold. First, it proved that organized, nonviolent action could get real results. And second, it introduced the nation to the boycott's incredibly charismatic young leader, a pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So what Montgomery proved was huge. It showed that this fight wasn't just going to be won by lawyers in courtrooms. The real power was with everyday people. Students, church members, regular citizens who were ready and willing to take direct action.
And this idea of direct action, it led to one of the most famous tactics of the era, the sit-in. The strategy was just so simple, but so incredibly powerful. It started with 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who just sat down at a whites-only lunch counter. Their quiet, dignified protest was a direct challenge to the sheer absurdity of segregation, and the idea, well, it spread like wildfire, forcing businesses all over the South to finally integrate. So the next year, activists decided to raise the stakes even higher with something called the Freedom Rides. The goal here was a little different. It was about testing federal laws that had already banned segregation on interstate buses. They absolutely knew, they would be met with violence. And that was part of the point, to expose to the entire country that the southern states were just ignoring federal law and to force the federal government to step in. And believe me, when it came to integrating schools, the resistance was absolutely fierce. We're talking about situations like in Little Rock, Arkansas, and at the University of Mississippi, where it literally took the President of the United States sending in federal troops and marshals just so a few black students could go to class. It was a shocking display of just how far segregationists were willing to go.
So you can feel it, right? All of this confrontation in the courts, at lunch counters, on buses, it was all building to a boiling point. The movement was basically putting the entire nation and the federal government in a position where they had to finally pick a side.
And then came Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. This is when the whole world saw the raw, ugly face of segregation. The police commissioner, Bull Connor, turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters, and that included young children. Those images were broadcast around the globe. Suddenly you just couldn't look away anymore. Public opinion shifted like overnight, and the pressure on Washington to pass a real civil rights bill became immense.
And to build on that momentum, to really seize the moment, leaders organized the March on Washington. The sheer scale of it was just staggering. More than 250,000 people showed up. This was more than a protest. It was this beautiful, powerful, unified call for jobs and freedom, all capped off by Dr. King delivering his I Have a Dream speech right there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. An absolutely historic moment.
All of this pressure, from the streets, from public opinion, it led to some absolutely landmark changes in the law. First came the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically took a sledgehammer to the entire legal structure of Jim Crow. And then, just a year later, after the horrific violence of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, came the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This finally put federal muscle behind protecting the right for every single citizen to vote.
Okay, so with these huge legal victories in the bag, the movement itself started to change. The questions got tougher, you know? They started tackling deeper problems like economic inequality and systemic racism, and new voices started to rise up with different ideas about the best way forward. And this change brought different ideas, different philosophies to the forefront. Dr. King's powerful message of nonviolence and integration was still at the heart of things for sure, but other leaders, like Malcolm X and later Stokely Carmichael, started giving voice to this growing frustration with the slow pace of change. The Black Power movement emerged, emphasizing things like self-defense, cultural pride, and the need to attack those deep economic problems that new laws couldn't fix all on their own.
And then, right in the middle of all this change and debate, the movement suffered an absolutely unthinkable blow. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It sent shockwaves of grief and anger across the country and around the world, silencing the movement's most powerful voice and really marking the end of an era.
But even a tragedy that immense couldn't erase the legacy. I mean, the civil rights movement totally reshaped the laws and the very fabric of American society. It showed the entire world the incredible power of organized, nonviolent grassroots protest. And it became the inspiration, the blueprint for so many other human rights struggles that followed, from the fight for women's rights to LGBTQ+ rights, both here and all around the globe.
And all of this really brings us to a final thought. The story of this movement is such a powerful reminder that history isn't just made by famous people in high places. It's made by students, by pastors, by factory workers, by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept injustice. So it leaves us with a really important question to think about. Of all the lessons from their struggle, their courage, their strategies, their sacrifices, which ones do we need to remember and use the most in our world today?